By now, the silent film industry has achieved such a degree of perfection in combining action and music in marvelous synchrony that today some reproductions of operas can be considered true and complete artistic spectacles. Had we not just heard Marco's excellent paper, it might surprise us today to learn that these words were written more than a decade before the emergence of sound film. Casa Ricordi, Italy's foremost music publisher, wrote this in 1914, a mere 3 years after they began collaborating with film companies. By this time, Ricordi had already started production on their first film score and would embark upon a second shortly thereafter. The second remains well known, the score for Rhapsodia Satanica, yet the earlier score has been all but forgotten. Nevertheless, it marks a significant moment in the history of opera and cinema because it represents the first time that Casa Ricordi created a specially synchronized score for the filmic adaptation of an opera. The opera in question was Alberto Franchetti's 1902 Germania, which Ricordi adapted in partnership with the Italian company Savoia Film. The 1914 Germania is an exceptional case in the context of Italian silent films. Not only was it one of the few silent-era films to be accompanied by a specially synchronized score, but the score itself has survived, though unfortunately, the film footage has been lost. Although Ricordi's film score for Germania is occasionally mentioned in discussions of silent-era film music, with the exception of work by Oliver Huck and Richard Erkins, it has seldom been examined in great detail, and almost never in the broader context of the historical relationship between opera and cinema. Even more notable than the score's survival, however, is the existence of heretofore unexamined records of its creation history. Within Ricordi's archives are records of the initial project proposal, contract negotiations, financial reports, and discussions about the film's artistic details. Specifically, the archival sources shed light on Ricordi and Savoia Film's respective goals and expectations in embarking upon such a project, how Ricordi approached creating their first synchronized film score, and the unexpected challenges encountered in the collaborative process. In examining the film score and the negotiations that preceded it, I uncover part of the lost history of how the Italian opera industry responded to the emergence of cinema, and what it meant to translate or adapt an opera and its score to the silent screen. Overall, the history that I have reconstructed is based on my extensive research in the Ricordi Company's archives, my detailed comparative analysis of the film score, and my statistical analyses of filmographies pertaining to Italian silent film production. In demonstrating one way in which an early filmic adaptation of an opera attempted to realize and interact with an opera's musical elements, my investigation reveals the opera industry's role in such adaptations during the silent era. In order to establish the broader context into which the 1914 Germania was born, it is important to first understand the state of the Italian film industry and Ricordi's previous experiences with cinema. With this background in mind, I will then address the contract negotiations and production process before turning to the film score itself. By the time the Germania negotiations began, the Italian film industry was, as Marco has indicated, at the peak of what would retrospectively be termed the anni d'oro, or golden years of Italian cinema. Though the birth of cinema is typically marked in 1895 with the Lumiere brothers moving pictures in France, Italian cinematic production did not begin until 1905. Despite its late start in Italy, in the ensuing years both the medium and industry grew rapidly. My calculations indicate that the annual number of films released grew from less than 20 in 1905 to over 1,000 in 1913, and the number of credited film companies grew from a few to over 60. Moreover, the films themselves became consistently longer. In 1906, the average length of a film produced in Italy was about 100 meters, or 4.5 minutes. By 1913, films were on average more than 4 times longer. What is more, the first years of Italian cinematic production also demonstrated a marked interest in adapting literary and operatic subjects. My conservative estimates indicate that by 1913, more than 6 dozen Italian films had appeared whose titles indicate possible operatic connections. Thus, even in its early years, Italy's film industry was looking to subjects that had long sustained its opera industry. Prior to their partnership with Savoia Film, Ricordi had previously worked with other film companies on various opera-related projects. Based on these experiences, the standard negotiation procedure would involve the initial contract proposal, discussions of the particulars, and approval of the final contract. When it came to producing a film score, however, Ricordi entered unknown territory with Germania. Though the firm had previously discussed the creation of synchronized scores for other film projects, this was the first time that that vision became a reality. By engaging with the film industry, Casa Ricordi wanted to maximize their involvement in the cross-fertilization of opera and cinema. If film companies were interested in opera and there was a demand for cinematic versions, the music publisher wanted to be involved in this process and to influence, even control, artistic quality, which might, after all, reflect back on the genre of opera. Even more broadly, Casa Ricordi wanted to ensure that they, and by extension the opera industry, would benefit from such projects. The choice of Franchetti's Germania for cinematic adaptation would have appealed both to Savoia Film and to Ricordi. The historical film genre was one of Italy's cinematic specialties during the silent era, representing the industry's most profitable and popular products. For Savoia Film, Germania was thus a logical choice for adaptation because it tells the story of a fraught love triangle amidst the political strife in Germany during the Napoleonic Wars. Capitalizing on the opera's historical resonances, the film company likely sought to maximize the film's prospective audience by appealing to two distinct bases: those interested in historical films and those interested in opera adaptations. At the same time, Ricordi anticipated the publicity that the film could provide Franchetti's opera. After its 1902 premiere, the opera failed to become a regular feature on the operatic stage. Though Germania was Franchetti's most successful work, its popularity had lagged somewhat, as you can see, by 1913, and Ricordi hoped a filmic adaptation would rekindle public interest. The publisher wrote, "We benefit ourselves with cinematic reproductions. We will be able to promote greater awareness of our operas, many of which have been forgotten, thereby reviving them in the favor of the public." It was therefore not merely the film industry that might benefit from engaging with opera. The opera industry also sought ways to benefit from the new medium. Ricordi's negotiations with Savoia Film began in October 1913. In addition to requesting 2,000 lira as an advance payment of the anticipated profits, Ricordi initially proposed that Savoia Film also pay an additional 500 lira to cover the costs of an arranger, and then be contractually obligated to purchase a minimum of 50 copies of the score. Although Savoia Film quickly agreed to the advance payment, they were apparently taken aback by the request to invest financially in the score, citing this as the main reason for almost giving up the idea of using the subject of the opera Germania for a cinematic reproduction. The final contract waived the 500 lira charge. Furthermore, Ricordi offered Savoia Film a 30% discount on the cover prices of the scores, which they pointed out could be resold at market price, whereby turning a significant enough profit. The final contract thus clearly demonstrates Ricordi's commitment to the endeavor. The music publisher would cover all the production costs for the film score, and through the discount would hand Savoia Film a significant portion of the profits to be made from its sale and rental. Shortly after the contract was finalized, however, Ricordi realized that they had grossly underestimated the time and labor necessary for preparing the film score. The publisher initially expected that producing a score would be similar to preparing or producing any other type of score. According to their usual practice, the firm's tasks would begin after receiving the manuscript from the composer and would entail extracting instrumental parts, creating piano reductions, manufacturing the engravings, and then proceeding with printing, with each stage accompanied by a round of editing or proofing. For producing the synchronized film score, the key difference was that Ricordi would be responsible for constructing the manuscript version by compiling musical excerpts from Franchetti's opera. Although the remainder of the process more or less replicated the publisher's usual procedures, Ricordi failed to account for the time and effort required to make the musical selections and synchronize them to the film. The music publisher had originally indicated that the score would be ready within 1 month after receipt of the film. Exactly when Ricordi received the footage is unclear, but surviving details allow us to speculate as to this timeline. As listed here, evidence from the company's correspondence suggests that the publisher began working on the film score by March 1914, which, according to Ricordi's earlier projections, would have meant that the score be completed by late April. By June, however, the score was still not complete, but Ricordi received the shocking news that the film had already been released in the United States. Despite what this may seem, it was not in fact a breach of contract. Savoia Film was contractually bound to purchase 50 copies of the score, but was not legally required to use them. Ricordi quite understandably assumed that Savoia Film would use the film score, that is, until they heard of the film's North American release. Ricordi continued working in the hopes that the film would not be released elsewhere without the score. Though they were thus willing to move past the premature release, they did not want to underestimate the value of the music. It seems to us that our common interest should not be impugned due to the folly of representing the film without the music, which, we repeat, was to be the main element of its success. Ricordi thus defended the music as crucial, while Savoia Film apparently saw it as decidedly secondary. Despite assuring Savoia Film that their workshop had been achieving some real miracles for bringing the immense work to completion in the shortest time possible, Ricordi informed the film company that the score would likely not be complete before the end of July. One of the challenges was the necessity of producing several versions of the score. In Italy, the options for musical accompaniment, as we have discussed, varied from cinema to cinema. Some had large orchestras, others small chamber groups, and some merely a pianist. Accordingly, different arrangements had to be produced. The choice of excerpts, the adaptation to the scenes of the film for synchronicity, the perfection of the score for piano, for orchestra, both large and small, the engravings of the part, etc., demanded and still demand time, Ricordi wrote on 18 June. The following week, the publisher summarized their remaining tasks, extracting instrumental parts from 1,500 manuscript pages, making the engravings for 970 pages, correcting the engravings twice, and then repeating the entire process for the piano reduction. Even if you are untrained, Ricordi concluded, you can understand the necessity of at least 5 months for preparing the material, 5 times the original prediction. Ricordi's most brazen request, however, came in mid-July. They asked Savoia Film to relinquish their contractual right to purchase the scores at a discount. Ricordi's rationale was that granting the film company the agreed-upon discount would necessitate raising the prices. We propose to you, precisely in order to keep the prices as shown in the attached list and not to be forced to raise them further, not to supply you any discount on the indicated prices for the first 30 orchestral materials and 100 scores for piano, and to afford you instead the 30% discount required by our letter of 8 November, 1913 on the subsequent supplies. If you do not accept our proposal, we would have to raise the prices by 40%, which, we repeat, would make it even more difficult to sell the special editions. In the common interest, we recommend, therefore, accepting our proposal. Working out the math, these new estimates represent drastic increases from the original contract. Yet Ricordi deemed these price increases necessary, particularly since the final contract relieved Savoia Film of any fiscal responsibility for the film score's overhead costs. The fear or threat was that raising the prices would ultimately counteract the goal of selling as many copies as possible of the reductions themselves. You will easily comprehend that the relative expense borne by us is by no means exaggerated, Ricordi concluded. The request reveals Ricordi's inexperience with this type of project. The publisher essentially asked Savoia Film to understand why they had so grossly underestimated the work and time necessary and to share in the fiscal consequences. According to the publisher's calculations, they spent nearly 20,000 lire preparing the film score, nearly 10 times the amount Savoia Film had originally paid as an advance, and exponentially more than the 500 lire fee Ricordi had initially requested to cover the arranging costs. Regardless of the film company's response, Ricordi was at considerable risk of losing money, and would certainly do so if Savoia Film only purchased the minimum number of copies. Unsurprisingly, the film company balked at Ricordi's request. Such costs were too much for Savoia Film to manage, and they immediately sold their contract to a large French company, incidentally on the very day that World War I began. It seems that the film was later only released in Germany under the title Das Volk steht auf, but likely without Ricordi's film score. At this point, Ricordi's records regarding Germania essentially drop off, likely due at least in part to the war. Ricordi did, however, complete the score, and a close examination assists us in conjuring up a hypothetical, yet considerably detailed recreation of the film. Since the film footage of Germania itself has been lost, its exact length is unknown. However, the score indicates that it was meant to be a film of epic proportions. As we shall see, the film score relies almost exclusively on excerpts from the opera's piano vocal reduction. Using an approximation of the tempi in the opera, the score would be able to accompany a film of nearly 3 hours in length, roughly 4,200 meters. Although such a lengthy film would have been extraordinary at the time, it would not have been outside the realm of possibility. This was particularly true for Savoia Film, who, at that time, held the record for the longest Italian film made, with a 3,000-meter historical epic from the previous year. As we can see here, the score's cover page proudly emphasizes the film's connections to the opera. The cues, however, indicate that what unfolded on the screen differed significantly from the scenic action featured on the operatic stage. The cues are arranged similarly to stage directions in a traditional score, but instead of aligning screen action to music, the cues aid the performer or conductor in aligning the music to the on-screen images. They have a range of functions, introducing main characters, describing the setting, explaining forthcoming action, or stating lines that the characters say. As Ricordi wrote to Savoia Film, both the orchestral score and the reduction for pianoforte will have all the cues and the titles perfectly corresponding to the film in such a way that it will be as easy for the conductor as for the accompanist on the pianoforte to be in perfect harmony with the dramatic development of the film, and therefore to obtain that marvelous effect that the fusion of the music with the scenic movements of the characters of the screen can and must give. Overall, the cues indicate that the film broadened the historical aspects of the opera. The differences between the opera and its adaptation are summarized in this graphic, which shows roughly how dramatic action was imported from the 5 sections of the opera into the 6-part film. As we can see, the film content included a significant portion of added or expanded material and also condensed portions of the opera. The most prominent example of expanded content is the Battle of Nations, to which the film devotes considerably more time, and which Franchetti portrayed not on stage, but rather via the intermezzo sinfonico. Naturally, the visual void would not have translated well to the opera screen, so the film realized and expanded upon the details provided in the libretto. Other changes involved the addition of historical material, including a host of military and political figures, as well as a number of new locations consistent with the expanded historical narrative. Though impractical for an opera, such additions worked well with the filmic medium, unfettered by the physical limitations of a traditional stage. The inclusion of additional characters and locales functioned as visualizing moves, taking content merely alluded to in the opera and actually depicting it on the screen. The film thus realized the operatic plot according to the strengths of the cinematic medium. Since Ricordi compiled the score to fit the completed and adapted film, their work necessitated restructuring and reordering musical selections, as well as selecting accompaniment for scenes not originally depicted in the opera. The music is almost entirely composed of exact quotations from the opera's piano vocal reduction. Brief transitional material is sometimes inserted between 2 passages, such as shown here, but this usually accounts for no more than a measure or 2. The most obvious changes are the removal of the vocal lines. Further modifications are usually limited to the excision of metronome markings and recitative, or to the repetition of certain passages. There is occasionally some transposition to smooth over transitions between musical excerpts, and even fewer instances of textural simplification. Compiling what they had deemed a faithful reproduction primarily involved selecting passages from Franchetti's score and ensuring that the music and transitions fit smoothly with the dramatic action. Though the film score almost exclusively uses excerpts from the opera, it does not deploy them chronologically. This graphic indicates the source from which the film score draws musical material, with each colored box representing a continuous section of copied material. Ricordi sought to ensure that the film score foregrounded the most sensational moments. Overall, it relies heavily on the opera's most well-known pieces or melodies, and on its most dramatic scenes. Especially prominent, for example, are the melodies from Federico's famous aria Studenti udite voi and Carl Maria von Weber's Lutz als wilde Jagd, which Franchetti had incorporated into the opera as a touch of historical and local color. Thus, while the additions and expansions may have weakened the film's visual connections to Franchetti's opera, the accompaniment made these ties undeniable. By relying on principles of repetition and on memorable melodies and musical moments, the score for Savoia Film's Germania prefigures techniques used in Hollywood film music of the early sound era. This is likely because of the shared industrial aspects of the film score production. For Germania, the score was not specially written by a composer. Instead, a Ricordi company employee, Renato Tanaglia, arranged it. Indeed, the composer was functionally removed from the equation. Although Franchetti lived until 1942, there are no records of his involvement with the Germania adaptation. As film historian Sergio Micheli has argued, film music in the 1930s was the product of a complex system of production mechanisms, with the director of the music department serving as the linchpin. As I have shown, Ricordi's production of the Germania film score was similar. With Germania, I argue that the production process was less artisanal than industrial, particularly in comparison to the firm's typical process for working with composers on new scores. This is not to say that the work of compiling a film score was not artistic, but that the publisher, rather than the composer, was at the center of production. In large part, this was due not only to financial and temporal concerns, which demanded a more rapid production speed, but also to the fact that the score was compiled rather than newly composed. Overall, the music publisher was devoted to maintaining the artistic quality of the final product, but although they anticipated the more artisanal process characteristic of their usual score production, producing a film score, as they discovered, necessitated a more commercially minded approach. In conclusion, although the difficulties encountered in producing the score for Germania might have discouraged the pursuit of similar projects, it had the opposite effect on Ricordi. The project was deemed sufficiently successful to interest them in further collaboration with the film industry, and particularly in the production of synchronized scores for filmic adaptations of operas. After Germania, Ricordi sought to prevent the pitfalls experienced with Savoia film. In particular, the film firm ensured that overhead costs for score production would be shared more equitably and included clauses in their contracts that required the films to be accompanied by the specially reduced scores. Going forward, Ricordi found filmic adaptations so appealing that they were willing to go against a composer's wishes in order to make the necessary changes to bring an opera to the screen. As Ricordi stated in relation to a film project regarding Aida shortly before the onset of World War I, the prohibition was imposed on us by the great maestro for those elevated reasons of art and aesthetics that always guided him in the creation of his operas. However, in the current case, we maintain that an exception can be made from such rigorous artistic principles without deviating from the highest intentions wished by the author. We propose to adapt the music and action to the exigencies of the cinematic scenes to a limited extent, but always in a manner such that one has a nearly perfect artistic reproduction in terms of both the scene and the music. Casa Ricordi believed that they could manage the artistic quality of the final product, ensuring a similarly sufficient level of perfection on the screen as they did on the stage. So certain were they in their ability to guarantee artistically perfect cinematic adaptations that they were even willing to go against composers' express wishes regarding modifications or cuts to their operas. Ultimately, Ricordi's rationale for their continued involvement with the film industry seems to have been that, through partnering with their firm, film companies would be able to produce films of greater artistic quality. Ricordi, in turn, would not only receive a percentage of the royalties, but would also maintain a degree of control over how their repertoire was used, and hopefully would promote the adapted works to a broader public. As evidenced by their involvement with Germania, Ricordi found it natural to accompany filmic adaptations of operas with appropriately synchronized music, even though it required a significant investment of time and money. As the possibility for synchronization expanded during the silent era, the publisher was thus invested in realizing and enabling cinema's musical potential. In turn, this provided Ricordi the opportunity not only to maintain control over the cinematic use of their operatic repertoire, but also to open doors for incorporating music into the film industry in the future. Thank you.